Hello, everyone. A really warm welcome to this session, a conversation between Sebastian Faulks and Ahmed Rashid as part of the 2021 Lahore Literary Festival. My name is Michael Houlgate, and I am the British Council's director in Lahore, and I am absolutely delighted to be able to introduce this session. The British Council has been a long-standing supporter of and partner of the LLF over a number of years, and has tried our best to support the work that, brilliant work that LLF does, supporting Pakistan's flourishing, vibrant literary scene. And I'm really pleased that we've been able to continue that support this year in 2021, despite the challenging situation that we're all in that's preventing us from being face-to-face as we normally would be. So this session that I'm introducing today is, I mean, it's a real thrill for me to be able to present, to introduce, because we've got such, well-respected luminaries taking part, Sebastian Faulks and Ahmed Rashid, neither of which really need any introduction, but, as tradition dictates, I will introduce them and then hand over to Ahmed for the conversation. So Sebastian is a British novelist, journalist, broadcaster, widely hailed as one of the best writers of his generation. He's written several best-selling novels, including perhaps one of his best known, which is Birdsong, which has sold over 2 million copies. Sebastian started his career in journalism, and he continues to contribute columns and articles and reviews to a number of newspapers and magazines. He's also written and presented a couple of major TV series in the UK, one of which was on Churchill's Secret Army, and one on the British novel, which was called Folks on Fiction. He's well known for his French trilogy, which includes Birdsong and also Charlotte Gray, which was made into a film starring Cate Blanchett in 2001. I won't list all of the books he's done, but a couple of other well-known ones are the #1 bestseller, A Week in December, which was published in 2009, and continuing Ian Fleming's tradition, the James Bond book, Devil May Care, published in 2008. So thank you very much, Sebastian, for joining us at this session of the LLF. Sebastian will be in conversation with Ahmed Rashid, who is a journalist and a best-selling author of a number of books on politics and foreign policy in Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Central Asia. Ahmed has worked as a journalist and a foreign correspondent. He's contributed to a number of Pakistani and international publications over the years. He's appeared regularly on TV and radio news, including major international outlets like CNN and BBC. And he's written a number of books exploring politics, conflict, terrorism in Afghanistan and Pakistan, including famously The Taliban, The Descent into Chaos, and Pakistan on the Brink. So really pleased that you can be with us as well, Ahmed. And now I'll hand over to you for the conversation with Sebastian.
I just want to open by mentioning that I was the reporter for Afghanistan and Pakistan, and Sebastian was the books editor, the literary editor in London, for the independent newspaper, which started up. We were founding members of the Independent in the mid-80s. And when I would arrive from Pakistan, starved for new literature, he would avert his eyes and allow me to pinch a few novels from the piles that surrounded him in his office. And so I'm doubly thrilled to have him join us today, because he certainly educated me about what was good fiction and what was bad fiction. Now he's a best-selling author with prizes tucked under his belt. And I've tried to read most of his books. They are a joy to read. But let me just start by first asking you, which I should have asked you then, in fact, how did you become a novelist from being a journalist? What was the impulse? Were you writing short stories at school or something?
No, well, first of all, hello to everyone. Hello, Ahmed, nice to see you again, albeit in a computer screen. The Independent seems a very long time ago somehow, doesn't it? Yeah. And I had always wanted to be a novelist, really, from the age of about 13 or 14. I was a rather difficult little boy at school, and I didn't get on with the school where I was, and I didn't particularly want to be be a soldier or a lawyer or a doctor or anything. And then one day I discovered literature when I was about 14, D.H. Lawrence and Jane Austen and Dickens. And I thought, oh, well, this is what excites me. This is what I want to spend my life doing. And furthermore, it seems to be respectable. People don't mind you being a writer. It's, my parents would prefer me to be a lawyer or a doctor, obviously, but, writer's reasonably respectable. So I set my mind on it then. I mean, the difficulty really was making a living because, even if you get a book published, it only sells a few copies and, you can't make a living from it. So after I'd left university, I first of all had a year out when I wrote a novel, which was really terrible, and it wasn't published by anyone. And then I got a job teaching, and then I moved from teaching into journalism. But all the time I was, my main goal was to be a novelist. But I had no problem with the idea of doing other jobs to pay the rent. So when you and I met, Ahmed, in 1986 at The Independent, I'd already published one book called A Trick of the Light while I was working at a previous newspaper, The Telegraph. And all the time at The Independent, I was scribbling away in the evenings and at weekends, writing more fiction. So the fiction really always came first. And then when I left The Independent in 1991, after 5 years there, 5 very good years, I thought, well, now's the time. Let me see if I can give it another go. So I took another year out and I wrote a book called A Fool's Alphabet. But I was expecting always to return to work of some kind. And then after that, my fourth novel was called Birdsong. And that did sufficiently well that I was able to postpone the return to work. And that was in 1993. And I've managed to postpone it until 2021. But who knows? If the sales fall down tomorrow, I'll be ringing you up and asking if you need a London correspondent.
Well, that's amazing. That means Birdsong came out very early on in your career. I mean, it is such a mature and important novel, but I didn't realize that it was so early on.
Well, it was my fourth book. I was 39 when I wrote it, and it was the fourth published book, but I'd written a couple more before which hadn't been published because they were not very good. So, it wasn't like a first book. I wasn't like 21, I was 40 by the time it came out. But I think that it's a book like that, you need a lot of physical strength. I mean, it's quite a big undertaking in those days. You're typing. The typescript was something like 650, 700 pages. And, writing a very intense, quite serious book like that is a tremendous strain, not just mentally, but emotionally, and really almost physically. So, you're better off being relatively young than relatively old. I mean, most novelists sort of develop much later than poets. Most poets write their best stuff in their 20s and 30s, and then it just seems to sort of peter out, with exceptions, of course. But most novelists, the 20s and 30s, again, with exception, you're learning how to do it. Your 40s and 50s are your best time. And then after that, it begins to go away, unless you're very disciplined.
Tell me, your description of trench warfare in Birdsong, which I consider your finest novel, is really quite stunning. You show us the mud, the brutality, the ferocity of the dead and dying soldiers in their thousands lying in the trenches and the mud-laced tunnels that soldiers built to protect themselves. How are you fascinated with so much suffering and war? I mean, it's very unusual to be writing about the First World War.
Yes, it certainly was. When my editor actually left and a new editor came in, and she rang me up and said, let's meet for a drink. I gather, we're going to be publishing your next book. Will you tell me what it's about? So we met for a drink and I told her it was set during the First World War. And she looked absolutely appalled. She sort of lowered her head into her hands. And I explained to her that it was something I had to do. And being a good professional, she kind of rallied she said in the end, well, we'll do the ban with it. I think, you know, it was the answer to how I got so interested is long and not really that interesting. But I, as a little boy, aged about 12, at my school, I had to read out one day the names of all the oldest of my school who had died in the First and Second World Wars. And there were only about 80, 85 kids in this school. But the names went on so long that by the end, my throat was quite red and sore. And I remember thinking, even at the age of 12, something very peculiar must have happened here. And the history teacher seemed quite reluctant to talk about it very much. And I often wondered later if he'd had a brother or a relation who died in the First World War. And then through writing other books, I had to research other periods of history, but everything seemed to lead me back to this period. And, you know, initially, like many people, I think I just felt repelled by it, by the idea of war, by the idea of 10 million men being killed for reasons which no one to this day can really agree upon. And I think what really fascinated me about it, though, was the fact that they continued for so long. And I used to wonder as I began to read about it, whether it was histories or whether it was researching documents, individual accounts left, you know, anonymous soldiers, why they had at no point said to one another, we won't go on with this, standing in a trench 100 yards away from the other countries of Europe, just firing lead into them for year after year after year. And I sometimes used to wonder what the politicians at home would be thinking. When would the death toll get to be such that they would say, maybe this isn't such a great idea, 5 million, 6 million, 8 million, 10 million, or would they go on till the last man in Europe was left? So that was the sort of philosophical idea behind it, which intrigued me. The idea of what kind of creature can do this? What kind of creature would be driven to this or would allow himself to be driven to this? And I always think I prefer personally to read novels which have some ideas behind them, some political thoughts that are not just a story of someone's life. They have ideas, themes, which give you something to think about. And that was very much the sort of animating theme behind Birdsong. So although it's a very detailed book about the war, it is also about, you know, what kind of creatures are we?
You said that when you were 14 years old, you read many of the British classics or literary classics. Was there any book that really influenced you to take this path of writing about war? And I mean, did you read War and Peace, for example, or did you read some other famous novel about conflict and death?
No, at that stage, the books I read I didn't read about war. I mean, I read the war poets, I suppose, Wilfred Owen, Siegfried Sassoon, and so on. But I had no particular interest in war at that time. But you see, growing up in Britain in the 50s and 60s, as I did, my father had fought in the Second World War, and my grandfather had fought in the First World War, as had everyone of our generation. It was completely normal. My father had been shot 3 times in the Second World War, wounded, and he still had, you know, scars in his arms. And one day when I was a kid, he went down to have a bit of shrapnel taken out of his arm. And this was, you know, this was normal in our generation. My grandfather had fought in the First World War and survived, but he was a newspaperman, and he went as a war correspondent in 1945 when he was in his late 50s with the Americans out of the east of France going into Germany. And he was killed while being a reporter, a war correspondent, shot crossing the Rhine at Remagen. So, you know, it was in our family, as it was in everyone's family in Europe, growing up at that time. So partly, you know, it didn't seem to me very remarkable. I just kind of assumed that I would fight, and my brother and I would fight in the Third World War. They seem to come around once in every generation. And so, but it wasn't sort of terribly remarkable to me as a kid. It's just like everyone's dad had been there. But it wasn't until I suppose I was a bit older, I thought, well, hang on. This is not really how things are meant to be, is it? That your grandfather and father have both been involved in these terrible conflicts. And there's another one round the corner, it appears. This isn't right. And so that's, it's just, but it's not until you get older that you sort of become questioning and well-informed enough to think, hang on, why is it like this?
Yeah. Birdsong starts with a pre-war love affair between a visiting Englishman, French woman who was married. And the opening scenes are set before 1914, as our hero stays in a small town in France. In a few years, he will return and fight in the Somme, where millions died on both sides. Yet this heart-rending history is replete with this dazzling love story, tender, erotic, unforgettable. How do you visualize both at the same time in the same novel? The idea of war and the idea of such passionate love.
I suppose it goes back to what I was saying just now about, while it is very specifically about the individual experience of men in that war, it is also about what kind of creatures are we. And so I suppose it came to me as I was writing that the war would provide only half the answer. How far can we go in brutality, in killing, in dismembering one another? Apparently, there are no ends to it. But that's not all we are. Human beings have other facets other than the purely destructive. And so I thought it would be interesting to look at the extreme of human experience at the other end of the spectrum. So the first part of the book was not ever going to be a sort of gentle, wistful love affair. It was going to be the sort of physical, the erotic equivalent of the Battle of the Somme, if you like. Very, very powerfully physical and passionate. This is what you can do with your bodies. Just as later on we'll see what other things you can do with your bodies in terms of dismembering them. So that was the idea, and I think it chimed with an idea I'd been thinking about in my previous book, which was called A Fool's Alphabet. I'd always been fascinated by the names of places and the kind of resonances that they had. One thinks of the sort of awful names of the 20th century, Auschwitz, Hiroshima, and so on. But what was Hiroshima like before? It was a sort of busy commercial port. Was there always something in that name that was destined to become a sort of metonym, a byword for horror? And likewise, Auschwitz, it was a sort of cavalry barracks, I believe, at some point, a fairly nondescript place. And the Somme, which has this terrible resonance in British culture as a place where 50,000 casualties occurred in one morning before 12 o'clock, the worst day in the history of the British Army. You might say the worst day in the history of Britain, really. But there's something about the word Somme, which sounds like a sort of church bell tolling, sounds like a funeral bell. But of course, for hundreds of years, it was just the name of a river in a rather nondescript part of France, really. And so I also wanted to look at what the battlefield was like before it became a battlefield, when it was just farms and villages and the outskirts of Amiens, this city in northern France.
I also love Charlotte Gray. I mean, it's a story of a British spy in World War II who heads for occupied France to carry out a special operations mission disguised as a French woman. As she makes contacts with the French resistance, she's also searching for her lover, an English airman missing in action. And the heroic role of the French resistance contrasts with the French collaborators who betrayed the resistance. It's a gripping story, and you conjure up the claustrophobic atmosphere of an occupied France and the underground resistance. How did you achieve this sense when you were not even born then, but the atmosphere you create around this woman as she tries to carry out task is extraordinary.
Well, you know, you're a journalist, Ahmed. You know, I'm a journalist. You get sent to places and told to, you've got until 6 o'clock that evening to give a detailed account of what's going on. And, you know, you ask questions, don't you? You can't ring up the news desk and say, I don't know, search me, how should I know? You've got to find out. And I do think that having been a journalist, I mean, although I was never really a hard news reporter, I'd been a general feature writer for a few years. And I had, the one thing I'd learned from journalism is that you can find things out, people will help. Even sometimes when you pick up the phone to someone to ask them about something quite delicate they've been involved in, and you're thinking, if I were you, I wouldn't be speaking to a reporter, but anyway, I'll ask him. And usually people will help. And, you know, information is discoverable. That's one thing I really learned from having been a journalist. But the other thing to remember, of course, is that France is only 18 miles away from England. I mean, you know, we're virtually contiguous. So, I mean, that is one of the great things about being English, is that you have this foreign country 18 miles away, which is completely different in every respect. If I drive north for 18 miles, I'm still in London. But the channel between Dover and Calais, you know, it's completely different cultures, histories, traditions, a completely different way of viewing the world. And because I'd long been excited by that, I'd spent a lot of time in France on holidays, traveling around, driving around. Great friend of mine had married a French man. So I mean, I knew the country fairly well. I studied French at school. I'd been to Paris, to university in Paris before I went to Cambridge, etc., etc. But to answer specifically your question about Paris under occupation, it was quite difficult. And the reason being that when I was writing the book in the mid-90s, which is after all quite a long time after the occupation ended in 1944, 50 years, very little had been written about it in French because it was deemed to be too sensitive, too controversial, too traumatic a subject, even at that distance of time. Books were starting to come out then in the mid-90s, but really the best account that you could find at that time of the overall history and politics was by an American called Robert Paxton, which had come out in the mid-70s. And this was an academic book by a historian at, I think, Harvard or maybe Princeton. But his bibliography at the end of his book, he didn't have one. And he said, the reason I don't have a bibliography is because no books have been written about this period. He said, there are 2 novels published at the time, which I recommend to give you a feel of the atmosphere. But as for the ins and outs of it, there are none. And he had based his own book on research of German military and French military records and, you know, local authorities, army archives and that sort of thing. So actually, it was difficult, though Paxton is a very, very good guide to the sort of big picture. But the lesser ins and outs, I can't really remember. I went to various archives in Paris. If you ever touch on anything to do with Jewish history, which Charlotte Gray does touch on, the deportations of Jews from Paris to Auschwitz by the Germans with the cooperation of the French police, which is a horrific story. Aspects of Jewish history are much easier to get at, because one of the great things that we know following the Holocaust is that worldwide Jewish historians and the Jewish community became very, very insistent that these things had to be recorded and remembered and so on. So that aspect of it was easier for me to get at, to find documents and historical records. But again, it comes to just finally to say that, you know, a lot of fiction writing, you have to get, if you're writing a serious book, you have to get the facts right, times right, and you can't have your character do something that he or she couldn't have done. But at the same time, you are permitted to use your imagination. So knowing that the country was divided in two, that France was divided between those who basically supported the Germans and those who basically supported the Allies, you then just simply have to imagine in your own head how that might be for you and your family and your friends who are likely to be completely divided in your loyalties. and what kind of thing, what kind of emotional struggles this would lead to, what kind of philosophical difficulties, and that you can make up.
Have you ever called yourself a historian rather than a novelist? Because your novels are full of history, and extremely quotable history.
No, I haven't. I'm not, and I think one of the reasons is that well, I never really studied history at school. I did, weirdly, a combination of subjects which precluded history. And it wasn't until I was researching novels that I found myself reading proper grown-up historical books for the first time, the age of about 30, really. But I mean, historians, and I know a few, I mean, that's real work. I mean, to be able to contribute anything on a subject, you've got to have read, 8,000 books on it. Whereas when you're writing fiction, and you have to speak the languages, you can't write about the Crusades without speaking the relevant languages of the countries which are involved. You can't write about the history of East Asia without speaking half a dozen languages, so on. But with fiction, you can read one, if you're lucky, you find one overview book which gives you the period, and then you can just dip in and out, and you don't have to take everything in. You're looking more for details. You're looking at details which would fit and work for the character who's already half in your mind. And sometimes things you read in historical books help shape your character. You want someone who does what it apparently was possible to do according to this history book. So if my character is able to do that, he's become already by definition a certain kind of person. So you get a sort of push and pull between fact and fiction. But I'm far too lazy to be a full-time historian. I mean, I've read a lot of history books, but only about 100th of what I would need to be to call myself a historian.
Right. Well, the key question as far as your writing is concerned, which I'm sure you've been asked at every meeting you've ever attended, your obsession with France. Most of your novels are set in France or Paris or not in England. I mean, or very few are set in England. I mean, where did this come from? Are you not at all inspired to write about, the Wales or Scotland or Ireland or any of these places?
I think the word inspired, which is the right word. It's a very old-fashioned word. We don't really talk about inspiration anymore. It sounds rather sort of highfalutin, but it's exactly that was the problem. When I first started trying to write, I looked around for subject matters in my country, and I simply wasn't inspired at all. Mind you, I was not alone. If you think about there is this big difference between America, for instance, India indeed, and Britain, which is that if you think of the great novelists of America of the last 50 years, you'd be thinking of Saul Bellow and Philip Roth and John Updike, among others, DeLillo, Cormac McCarthy. But thinking of Updike, Bellow, and Roth particularly, they write about their own lives, they write about the world outside their window. And when Saul Bellow writes about someone who works teaching in the history faculty at Chicago, who's of Jewish heritage, as a reader, you think, this is going to be interesting, the new world, the old world, probably his grandfather escaped a pogrom in Russia. You feel this is going to be important and weighty. But if in England you say, my main character teaches in the history department in Birmingham, people just start to snigger. And it's something to do with British people not being able to take themselves very seriously. It's what I call the Neasden effect, after the satirical magazine Private Eye, which, if it just says the word Neasden, which is a perfectly ordinary part of London, everyone falls around laughing because it suggests something silly and trite and vulgar and hopeless and second rate in every way. And it is a very odd thing. But if you think of the British novelists of, roughly contemporaries of mine, Ishiguro, He doesn't write realistic novels about contemporary England. Martin Amis did not write contemporary. I mean, he wrote surrealist books which dealt with, but he didn't take it head on. Salman Rushdie, again, a surrealist, and he writes about all sorts of countries around the world. You'd be very hard pressed. There is no English Roth, there is no English Bellow, there is no English Updike. There are people who write comedies, parodies, satires. The closest that we have to, I mean, I was talking about Bellow writing about a historian in a faculty. We have that. It's called the campus novel. It's a comedy. We don't do serious novels about contemporary England. The greatest novelist writing at the moment in English, probably Hilary Mantel, writes entirely about Tudor England, for heaven's sake, half centuries ago. We just don't, it's something about the culture which makes it almost impossible for us to do it. And it's very, very weird. But, you know, if I started, I always wanted to write serious books, big books. But as soon as I started saying, you know, she was born in Reading and she went to the local girls' school, you know, all the seriousness went out of it, all the air went out of it. But as soon as I crossed the channel to France, which, as I was describing to you, is like Alice going through the looking glass. It is a completely different world. Every village there, every town suggested to me a story. Everything was, to use your word, inspiring.
But you know, I mean, the greatest literature in 18th, 19th century for 200-300 years came out of the English countryside, in the sense. I mean, the whole, take Jane Austen or anyone else. And you also are very based in the soil. I mean, when you know, writing about the trench warfare and France, etc. I mean, you are very embedded into the psyche of, well, France, but in nature and everything else. So I just thought that this would have moved you to look at England perhaps in a slightly different way.
Well, I have written about England. I wrote a book called Engleby, which is about a man of my age, of slightly different background, but you know, quite similar life experiences in some ways, with the small exception that he's a serial killer. And I also wrote a book called A Week in December, which you mentioned earlier on, which was entirely about contemporary London. And I set out in that book actually to write a sort of, you know, John Updike-like book, but very quickly it got away from me and it became satirical. It became highly satirical and critical of the way we live now, of investment banking in particular, but all sorts of what I saw as dangerous and false gods.
Right. My favorite love story of yours is Where My Heart Used to Beat. It is set in Italy in the middle of World War II. I think this is the most poignant love story you have written, especially the love affair between the hero Robert, a British officer, and the Italian girl Luisa. I commented to several people after reading this that we would all like a Luisa in our lives. Is there a story here? Is this pure imagination? Is there a story?
No, it's pure imagination. But actually, Where My Heart Used to Beat is also largely set in England. I mean, there are passages in Italy during the war, and the main character, Robert Hendricks, goes to visit this guy Pereira on his island off the south of France. But Robert is English, his childhood is English, his adulthood is English, he works in London. So there's plenty of England in that book. But yes, well, my father was in Italy during the war, and the description of the landings at Anzio, south of Rome, are to some extent based on things my father wrote. He wrote his memoirs down in his 70s, not for publication, but just so that my brother and I could have the pleasure of seeing them. And they're not incredibly interesting from a sort of literary point of view, but they have lots of very good details, which I borrowed. So to that extent, I did rely somewhat on my father's experiences, but the love affair is entirely of my own invention. And Louisa, She is rather charming, isn't she? She just...
Beautiful. I mean, absolutely stunning, yes.
I did rather fall in love with her myself, but she isn't really modeled on anyone in particular. But there's an interesting, when I finished it, I gave it to my wife to read, and she's always reads everything first. She's far too modest and diffident to make any big suggestion, but she did make one suggestion, which she said, "We love it, Louisa. She seems we really like her. She's so lively and practical, but it seems too easy for him. You know, he's not that attractive, is he really? And you know, why would she fall in love with him? And we need to know more about her." And so I then thought, well, that's right. Now I need to show Louisa in action. I need to show her having a life. You can't have women characters who are simply dependent on the affection of men. That's very old-fashioned and condescending. And so I wrote a whole scene, quite a long scene actually, of Louisa's day at work. She works for the Red Cross in Naples. But I had Robert watching her and seeing how busy she is, and she's running around organizing things, teaching, you know, handing things out. And this was a really good idea of Veronica's to put in this extra scene. And I think it really helped me focus on her and show what a sort of independent, autonomous character she was, which in turn made it more shattering for him when she reveals why it is that she can't really be with him. Spoiler alert, we better not share what her problem is.
I must say, I mean, you know, she's a remarkable character, and one of the best characters, you know, that you've written about. But tell us about your experience in turning your novels into movies. I note with sadness that some of your best books have not been turned into movies. I only remember Charlotte Gray because Kate Blanchett was in it. What has been the problem? I mean, your books are so visible and so strong as movies, as a script. I would have thought that every book of yours would have been turned into a movie.
Yeah, well, I think the short answer to that is just bad luck. I mean, luck is by far the biggest factor in life, in my view. Luck and hard work, talent, probably third. And just as I've been incredibly lucky in my publishers, I've been extremely fortunate in the response that my books have found. I mean, you know, these are quite difficult books. I mean, Human Traces, which is about the early days of psychiatry, and has a reading list about 40 pages long at the end. That sold nearly 1 million in this country. You know, who would possibly have foreseen that? I've been incredibly lucky. But at the same time, I've been very unlucky in getting films made. You know, films are not the be all and end all. The book's the thing. The book is the thing that will last and endure. But films are fun, and films can be very good, and films can indeed sometimes be better than the book. But Birdsong was in development for 25 years. And, you know, getting a film made is a question of having about 5 balls in the air at the same time. And the producers often had 4, but they never got the 5th one. Likewise, on Green Dolphin Street, likewise, which I've written a script for, which is with a colleague of mine called Rachel Wagstaff. Very good script, I said myself. The Girl at the Lion d'Or, another very good script.
Lovely story. Yeah.
But, you know, the actress wants to do it, she's in, the money's in, and then the director falls away. Or then the director's in, the studio's in, the money's there, and the performer falls away. You know, it's just balls in the air, and I don't blame anyone, but I'm sort of pretty fed up with the whole thing, frankly.
So you've never been tempted to kind of do it yourself, as it were? Or...
Yeah, very much so. I mean, after the long 25-year disappointment with Birdsong, I did in future say, I'll write all the screenplays myself. And everyone said, well, in that case, you'll never get it made because they'll want professional screenplay writers. But I kind of learned how to do it, and it's not rocket science. I'm not saying they're the greatest scripts ever made, and they probably would have done, you know, they might take another draft at some point. But the screenplays of things of mine that have been made have been not that great. So that seemed to me the way forward. But, you know, who knows? It's not over yet, Ahmed. You know, there's still years to come. You know, as I say, I've got 2 absolutely what Boris Johnson would call oven-ready scripts ready to go. And I was commissioned to do an adaptation for television recently of novels by Naguib Mahfouz, the Egyptian writer, which set in Cairo between the 2 wars, and which I really enjoyed doing. But they too, you know, they just couldn't sell them they couldn't sell the adaptation in the end. Almost balls in the air, not quite all at the same time. It's what happens of the, you know, the films you see on your screen are about 100th of those that are in development.
Yeah.
99 don't make it.
You mentioned On Green Dolphin Street, which is set in Washington in 1959, and it's about the Cold War and the Russian, the American bureaucracy, and a love affair in the middle of all this. Again, you've moved, you know, you've moved somewhere really far away to write this. It's a beautiful novel, and you've caught the atmosphere of the Cold War in Washington in the late 50s, early 60s. But again, my question is, why have you set it in Washington? You are not, I mean, you didn't think of setting it in Whitehall or somewhere else, closer to home. I mean, did you live in America for a time? Because your atmospherics are incredible.
No, I didn't live there, but I've been there a lot, partly as a reporter, partly for research, partly to publicize my books. You know what, I just can't really remember why it was set then and there. I think one of the first things, I think, now I'm getting to be old, I look back at my life and sort of, you can see things in some sort of perspective, and some things you can see as being formative, though they don't feel formative at the time. As I was saying to you before, reading out the names of all the boys who died from my old school, I was 12 and I just finished then and went off to play football. But I mean, in retrospect, I think that was formative. And one of the first things I remember in my whole life is my parents listening to the radio, which was giving the results of the US presidential election in 1960 between Kennedy and Nixon, which was very, very close. It was a bit like the election we've just had, when, you know, too close to call, but, you know, they were both slightly more sporting about it. And I remember thinking, God, the whole world is hanging on this. It's so exciting. So, you know, maybe somewhere lodged in my mind there was that. And one of the other things I remember, very early memory, being very excited by, is my father coming home from work one day with the evening paper which said, Russia puts a man into space. And my brother and I are both very excited about this, but my father was not so excited, and we couldn't really understand why. But the reason was quite clearly that it showed that the Soviet Union was more advanced technically than the West. And this was not good news. This is in 1960, 61, 59, 60, 61, this period. Not good news for the Cold War, the arms race, and the, you know, the trying to avoid a third world war. So again, I think I sort of thought it'd be nice to see that in perspective. But of course, researching that period was much easier because there are lots of people who were alive then, and it was easy to talk to them. And again, well, I read a hell of a lot. And the other thing is, I found that I wrote the book living in London. I was always getting stuck in the story. Unless I was in New York or Washington, I didn't know what was going to happen next. So I had to sort of commute across the Atlantic quite a lot, which was very expensive. But as I was saying to you before, sometimes you feel when you're researching, obviously part of you is saying, there's that building there. Yeah, the traffic flows down 5th Avenue, up 6th Avenue, et cetera, et cetera. So you make little notes. But at the same time, you're also finding out about your characters. And so it's this sort of interplay between fact and fiction. And a lot of the things I saw in New York gave me, I mean, for instance, I had a rather good guide called Zagat, which is a restaurant bar guy. And so I went to all the really old fashioned places in it. and all of them with these huge steakhouses with massive cauldrons where you can see these half cows hanging. And I was thinking to myself, well, Mary, my rather small, delicate main character, she's not going to want to eat a huge steak and so on. It's just not her thing. She's going to want a salad. And then I thought, but maybe Frank, maybe her lover, maybe he would. Now, why is he hungry? Oh, I see. It's because he came from a poor background. Okay, so how come he's got to be, he's become a newspaper man? Okay, well, it's because he got educated later in his life. He went to college on the GI Bill after the second. So again, you get this interplay between research and fiction.
Right. How interesting. You've done two very interesting projects. One, writing a novel in the style of P.G. Wodehouse about his creation, the famous butler Jeeves, and that is called Jeeves and the Wedding Bells, and another in the style of Ian Fleming, who wrote the James Bond book. Yeah. Your own James Bond book is called Devil May Care. Why did you do these? I mean, you have such an imagination, and your books are so fine. You didn't need to lean on famous authors, as it were, to enhance your reputation. I was just wondering why you did this.
I thought it would be fun. It's the short answer. The Bond thing came to me. The family approached me, and I assumed they'd made a mistake. I said, I don't write thrillers. I don't read thrillers. But they were very persuasive, and to be utterly crude about it, there was a lot of money involved, and I thought, well, this might. I've never paid anything into a pension. Maybe I can put this into, onto one side. The family were very nice. It was incredibly good fun to do. It only took me 6 weeks. So of course, there are some people who would say you shouldn't have done it. You've sort of, rather as you were suggesting earlier on, you didn't need to do that. But I don't view it as sort of a going down market. I just view it as having fun. And likewise, P.G. Wodehouse, I did initially say no to, on the grounds that, Fleming, it was very easy to work out how Fleming writes like a journalist, basically. Short sentences, lots of verbs, very few adjectives, very active. And it was quite easy for me to develop a version of that which would work well for a thriller type story. But P.G. Wodehouse is a sort of master of prose, and it's very, very light and delicate and lots of very subtle phrasing and allusion. And although what is actually happening in it is pure comedy and farce, silly people doing silly things, the prose itself is very, very difficult. And I wasn't confident that I could do it. But I'm just one of these people who can't resist a challenge. And there was no money in it either, not to speak of. But I had loved Wodehouse's books when I was young. I don't know if I know he's very popular in India. I'm not sure about Pakistan, but
absolutely
right,
very, very popular.
Oh, right,
yeah.
And it was just a challenge I couldn't resist.
Right, and we're nearing the end now, but I just wanted to know, you've not written about a modern war. We're not going to see a novel from you about Al Qaeda or terrorism or Afghanistan or anything like that, are we? No. And I just wondered if when all this extremism and all this conflict is going on around yourself right now, whether you would be moved to write a book about a modern war in some way or the other.
Well, I have touched on politics and fundamentalism in both A Week in December and in my last book, Paris Echo. Touching on it is about as far as I want to go, really. I think that one of the big problems the world is suffering at the moment is lack of reportage, objective, high quality journalism. And to me, the most chilling thing about the last 4 years in America is how easy it was for a man of very low intelligence simply to say, the news is all untrue. It's all untrue. It's all fake. I am saying this is the truth. Everything you read in the papers is untrue. And to begin with, he was laughed at, but after a bit, you now find that 40% of America believes the election was rigged. And that is how fragile America is a developed country. That is how fragile our grasp of fact and truth is. And, you know, I feel very strongly that modern day, you know, conflicts, problems, and so on need to be written about in depth, truthfully, by really good journalism, which is a terribly difficult thing now to make happen, because as you and I know only too well, Ahmed, you know, the funds, the money behind newspapers isn't really there anymore. And the days in the mid-80s when we first met, when you could start a new newspaper, and we had a massive foreign department at the Independent, offices all over the world, highly paid, very skilled reporters all over the world. Can't do that now because people don't buy newspapers. They just look at TikTok, you know, and that's really sad. But I don't think it's the domain of fiction. I think it's the domain of a beefed up, reinvigorated, truthful journalism.
And a question, I mean, what are your thoughts about the virus? I mean, do you think you could ever find yourself writing a novel about an epidemic sweeping through the world?
The last thing in the world I would want to read now is a novel about coronavirus. I'm living it. I
don't blame you.
I just cannot imagine anything more depressing or more pointless. What I want to read is a really objective, non-political, scientific piece of journalism on why some countries have fared better than others, and what we have learned and how we will universally and internationally respond better next time, sharing our experiences and sharing our expertise. But to lighten the subject, lighten the tone ever so slightly, Birdsong, the main character, Isabel, dies from Spanish flu in 1918. And Spanish flu was a much worse pandemic than coronavirus. So to be told all the time that we live in unprecedented times is not true. Much worse plagues than this have happened before. And it may be that in the novel I've just finished, I've got a new book coming out in September called Snow Country. And that covers a period, the first 35 years of the 20th century. And maybe there's a death from Spanish flu in that. Maybe there is, maybe there isn't. I'm just going to tantalize you.
Where is the book set? Is it set?
It's set mostly in Austria. It's sort of a continuation of a book called Human Traces. It's not a sequel. It's a completely standalone book. But just as I had a French trilogy, I hope to complete an Austrian trilogy as well. And this is the second book in it.
Wonderful, wonderful. Finally, I mean, you know, so many of your novels draw us into the past, as it were, looking at the world wars and other things. Has that managed to give you peace of mind in a way, that you're not looking at the daily newspaper to see where the latest terrorist bomb was put, but you're actually looking at something in 1914, or does that give a peace of mind or not?
I think that I can't really bear to read newspapers at the moment because it's either about Brexit, which is, you know, Britain inflicting this grievous act of self-harm for no reason because they've been lied to by their politicians, or about the virus, which is so unpleasant. So to some extent, in the pure sense of escapism, escaping from the difficulties of the modern world, yes. I mean, I've been puzzling a lot over events in Vienna in 1905. You know, of course, it's in some ways a more pleasant world, though it's not that pleasant when you think what's just around the corner for Vienna. But I do think that looking my whole life, everything I've written really, I think, it's been an attempt to understand my own life. I think that's the case with most writers, really. And it springs from being born in the middle of the 20th century in England and trying to get to grips with who we are and why my father was full of gunshot wounds and my grandfather was dead from gunshot wounds. And then having established that, which is the first lot of books I wrote, what is this history that has brought us to this? How could we have avoided it? The second lot of books I've written have been really about what kind of creature are we that could have gone so horribly wrong. So they're more about the makeup of Homo sapiens, of our minds and bodies and our behaviors. And they have a slightly more scientific and less historic bent to them. But I hope, to answer your question, that when I've answered to my own satisfaction those two questions, who are we and what are we, I will have enough peace of mind to go to meet my maker with equanimity.
Well, Sebastian, thank you so much. It's been absolutely wonderful. And I was never able to ask so many questions when I knew you 2 decades ago, but it's been wonderful. And thank you for giving us this insight into your novels.
It's my pleasure. Really good fun. I hope the festival goes very well.
Thank you. I hope you come to Lahore. I hope there will be a time when you can come to Lahore.
Allowed to.
Michael.
Thank you so much, Sebastian. Thank you, Ahmed. That was such a fascinating discussion. So many rich and interesting insights for us to be chewing over. Thank you, Sebastian, for sharing so generously about your influences, your life, your work. Lots for us to be thinking about in terms of history and war and the novel, and so many other interesting topics. So thank you. I was just riveted for the whole hour. Really, really interesting. Thank you, Sebastian. Thank you once again, Ahmed. Thanks to all of you for tuning in. I hope that you found it all as interesting and rewarding as I did. Hope that you have a good rest of the day, and please make sure to tune in to the rest of LLF.